So I have to be completely honest with you. This is one of those requests that when I first saw, I was immediately inclined to say no. After all, I've already done a video about Suikoden 2. However, after some thought, I decided, alright, I didn't really do a full in-depth look at it, and Lord knows I was basically going from memory, so why not? I'll go ahead and accept this one. After all, that is kind of the new policy, and we'll be seeing that again next week as well. The idea that I can't say no to a rumination request at this point unless it's on the forbidden list. So having pushed myself into the corner on this one, let's talk about Suikoden 2. For those of you not aware, Suikoden 2 is now available on the PSN. This is a fairly recent development. It's $10. I would recommend you go buy it right now. If you haven't already, of course. If you have not played this game, I recommend you go buy it and play it right now. You can end up playing it on your PS3 or your PS Vita or your PSP. For the curious, I was going to be playing it on my PSP until I had some issues with my PSP and couldn't actually get my PSP to accept my internet connection because of the security protocols my router uses, because the PSP is a little out of date when it comes to that stuff. So yeah, that would have been nice having it on the Vita, having it on the PSP. There's other ways to make that happen, but I didn't decide for the hassle. But why is this game so popular? Why is Suikoden 2 so commonly listed amongst some of the greats of RPGs in general, but especially amongst JRPGs? Why? I told you before once why FF7 became so popular. It was at a unique confluence of history. PS1 had just been pushed, and all the other factors that made the FF7 so super popular. It was widespread. Everyone knew about FF7. The irony here is Suikoden 2 became so popular for the exact inverse reason. So try to keep in mind the perspective here. Suikoden 1 came out and was fairly well received. A lot of people liked it, and... Oh, I'm sorry. Before I continue, one quick thing. I've heard about 12 different ways to pronounce Suikoden. I have also, I've heard some people emphasize the vowels differently, but say it the same way I do. Suikoden, as opposed to Suikoden. I've been saying Suikoden for a while, and ironically, when I looked it up, Suikoden, regardless of the emphasis on the vowels, is apparently the correct way to pronounce it. So I'm going to keep saying Suikoden, and I hope that doesn't bother you too much. Moving on. So, Suikoden 1, the first game, came out and was fairly well received, and was at a time when JRPGs were kind of having a resurgence. There was a big push for JRPGs in the SNES era, and then that kind of tapered off a little bit towards the end of the SNES era and the N64 era. Then the PlayStation 1 really started hitting it big, and several games, including Xenogears, Final Fantasy VII, and Suikoden, all just kind of resurged in interest in JRPGs in general. It is often considered the actual golden era of JRPGs, the PlayStation 1 era, alongside the Dreamcast, actually. Some people dispute that, but disputing or arguing doesn't really matter. The point was, it was a big time, at least here in the States, for games that are of that type and genre. Now, Suikoden 2 came out and received fairly poor support. Limited print run, didn't actually, didn't get a huge marketing campaign. Had a few adverts, but that was basically it. And then just kind of trailed off into obscurity. In other words, Suikoden 2 became hard to get a hold of. It is effectively the Princess Bride of the game-verse. In other words, whereas Princess Bride just kind of flopped when it came out, but then people discovered it and was like, oh, this is good, who would share it with other people who would like it, who would share it with other people who would like it. Suikoden 2 had the exact same situation. There's a catch, though. Suikoden 2 had a limited print run. Getting hold of a copy became harder and harder to do. By the mid-2000s, it was at the point where a single copy of Suikoden 2 was going for several $100s. Now, that in a nutshell explains everything about Suikoden's 2 popularity, in my opinion. Ignoring the quality of the game, I feel like pointing out. The game is good, and that's part of the reason why it received such word-of-mouth spread. But the fact that it was so difficult to get a hold of, the fact that it had this status as just kind of this hidden gem. There were people who had never actually played it, who had only heard about it. There are people who I could have discussions about it with, who knew who Luca Blight was, and knew enough about the story to actually discuss the plot of it, at least in a vague sense, who had never actually played it because it became that widespread because nobody could get a hold of it. The rarity increased demand. in this one case. And it's actually kind of funny in its own right, because let's just say that in some circles it was considered that Suikoden 2 was a complete failure. At least when it came out, like I said. Suikoden 3 barely got made. Suikoden 4 didn't receive a lot of support, and Suikoden 5 was basically their last gasp, with only Tierkris being after that. For reference, I'll be referencing a few things from each of these games within this one, but the primary focus of this rumination is on Suikoden 2, the one that was requested. One other interesting thing I find about the second game here is they wanted to make this game first. When they sat down and said, you know, we want to make a JRPG with the various formats that we do, this was the game they designed. And then they were like, well, hang on. We've never done this before. I can't believe this, by the way. How many times have you heard of a developer doing what I'm about to tell you? We have never made a JRPG before. We've never made something this ambitious before. Why don't we do a practice run? Why don't we go and try to make a game set in the same universe as a beta of this game, of the game we want to make? So they made Suikoden 1. They literally made Suikoden 1 as a testing platform and a learning experience, so that when they made Suikoden 2, they could put all their effort into it. You know how I've said many, many times that there's two things that happen with a sequel? Either the people get more experienced and more knowledgeable and more understanding of what they're doing, so the sequel's better, or they just stop caring or get fatigued, and so the sequel's worse. This is a pretty clear example of the former. Even despite the fact that I consider all five, yes, five, not all six, games in the series to be good, Suikoden 2 clearly just stands above and beyond all the others. And it's also worth noting that the developers consider Suikoden 2 to be their personal favorite as well. Good figure, right? Now, it is also worth noting that this is a game that could use a proper remake, in my opinion. Or at the very least a touching up, like the GBA versions of FF4, 5, and 6, for example. A good port, in other words. The English localization is severely lacking, as it was for most Japanese-released games of the era. In fact, as I've mentioned several times, FF9 was the first game I personally felt that had come out that actually had good localization. Not just translation, but good localization. Suikoden 2 has some pretty serious issues with its translation. There's some pretty weird bugs here and there. There's actually a couple of game-breaking bugs. And, of course, there's the fact that you can sequence break all over the place, most notably heading around Matilda fairly early on. Fun. And there's a few issues with regards to the underlying mechanics, and some of the things are very, there's a term called guide dang it. Is it guide dang it? In other words, the idea that if you don't have a guide or don't know what you're doing, you can accidentally screw yourself over or have no idea where to go. Kind of a holdover from the NES era, actually. There's a few issues with the game, but don't mistake me for speaking negatively about this amazing, fantastic game. I did start this rumination with saying, please go buy and play this game. So please don't jump down my throat, please. My throat hurts enough today already. I don't need people jumping down it right now. So I'm going to talk about... I really feel like I don't actually have a lot to say about this game, unfortunately. I hate myself for saying that. But I figured out why that is. It took me a while to figure it out. But it finally clicked with me. I'm going to talk about a few concepts of the game first. Then we're going to kind of go down the list of everything I felt like was worth sharing with regards to the characters. And then we're going to hit the big, a couple big points at the end. You know, my usual format here. So... There are 108 stars. It's a common function in the series in general. This is most likely coming from a concept that I don't know how to pronounce, but has to do with, let's see, is that a 6? Yeah, that's a 6. 36 stars of heaven, and 72 stars of earth, and the way they interact with each other and causing destiny's weave, basically. And so in each game there are 108 stars of destiny. If you get all 108, then destiny has been completed. The implication here, this isn't quite like the Elder Scrolls, but the implication is any playthrough that does not actually get all 108 stars does not happen in canon. In other words, Suikoden 2 assumes that in 1 you got all 108, and 1 assumes that in 5 you got all 108, and 5 assumes you get my point. Oh, by the way, for those curious, for those interested in picking up the series, I do recommend you play them in numerical order, because there's some interesting foreshadowing, and that's the way the narrative arc tends to work fairly well. But if you want to know the chronological order, it would be 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. Not sure where Tierkris sits on that list, to be completely honest with you. I'm also not sure Tierkris actually matters, although I will be referencing Tierkris several times. but I'll get to that in a moment. So the idea here being that if the people involved in lore do not successfully fully complete their destiny, then that timeline basically collapses and ceases to exist, and then another one is allowed to burgeon, another playthrough, which enables you to go and get all 108. If you fail again, the only ones that actually stick being the 108. I'm not sure what I think about that idea. Admittedly, at the time, it was fairly mind-blowing. Nowadays, that kind of a meta concept is a little bit more common in gaming. But then again, that's actually one thing Suikoden 2 is in a nutshell. A lot of the things Suikoden in general, I shouldn't just say Suikoden 2. It's like saying Baldur's Gate 2. It may be my favorite, but it wasn't the originator. It's several things that Suikoden did in general. They started concepts that nowadays are much more common. And I'll be referencing much more modern games that have taken, deliberately or otherwise, inspiration from the Suikoden series, and most notably this game. For example, let's just go and jump into this other concept that I want to talk about, the Suikoden mechanic. In other words, the base building, castle building thing, which was in 1 and is in 2. It's in all the Suikoden games. I've referenced this several times when it comes to Neverwinter Nights 2 had a mechanic like that. Dragon Age Inquisition tried and kind of failed to have a mechanic like that. Breath of Fire 2 and 3, actually, had mechanics like that. All these games, granted, obviously, Breath of Fire 2 did it before this game. But the point being, this concept is something that I've actually always liked. And I don't even have a great way to explain why. I like the idea of having my own fortress, my own kingdom, basically, and customizing it and setting up as I will. Now, it doesn't usually have a particularly large impact on things, especially in all the examples I just mentioned. You don't really have that much customization. Oh, garrisons and WoW, by the way, is another example. There's not really that much you can do with it. It's mostly about just filling it out. But it's still always been a degree of fun to me, and I've always had just a fondness in my heart for that kind of mechanic in general. Anybody who saw my Inquisition stream knows that I was automatically like, oh, cool, is this a Suikoden thing? Because I like that idea. It's just fun for me. I also like how in just about every case there's some abandoned, horrible, ruined place that you take and try to renovate, which again is an idea that appeals to me greatly. Lord knows that's true in the second game where we take North Window, which was a ruined wreck of a husk after Necklord went through there and turning into the base foundation for the Allied army. This is, speaking of which, so I just mentioned an army and a Necklord in one sentence, and that is a good way to explain the Suikoden appeal. See, the Suikoden is actually very high fantasy, but it's a weird form of high fantasy. If I were to describe it by a visual representation, I want you to imagine this flat plain, and all of this flatness, all this grass and whatnot, is common stuff, normal stuff, mundane stuff. People with swords and armor and shields and war and politics. Your fairly standard Tolkien-esque level, medieval-style RPG. And then every now and again there's just these spikes right here, fairly tall up spikes, because Suikoden is fairly down-to-earth setting that also simultaneously has very high fantasy concepts, hence the spike idea. So this is a setting which has always felt very, very low fantasy to me, but I have to acknowledge has, for example, multiple dimensions as a regular concept, has the runes and magic and monsters and dragons and all sorts of other horrible, horrible stuff. Undead is a thing that of semi-commonality, and of course the true runes. I usually refer to them as the trues for degree of perspective. And all of this is appealing to me. I do like the spikes concept, especially since it basically makes the world feel a little bit more low fantasy. I am reminded actually of another setting that does something very similar, Ivalice, which despite actually being a high fantasy setting, feels low fantasy because the majority of it is that flat plane with only the spikes, right? I said multi-dimensional stuff, so I guess this is as good a time I need to talk about that. So this has been a true thing since the first game. This is not something that was invented for Tierkris or anything else. And you really only get bits and pieces of this if you recruit everything and get all the story, which I'll talk about that in a moment too. There are multiple dimensions coexisting alongside each other in the Suikoden setting. And sometimes people can cross over from one to the other. I mean, I'd point out the obvious gate rune thing, But again, Tyrchus' entire premise was about being in one of those planes of existence and regularly folding other planes onto yourself so you could interact with the other planes and fighting against a villain who was actively trying to deconstruct some of this multidimensional aspect of the setting. It's a regular concept, and what's funny is most of the alternate dimensions are basically the same general idea of the prime dimension, the one that 4 through 3 happens in. Oh, by the way, for the curious, 4 through 3 does happen in one single dimension, but we do have visitors and characters from other dimensions who semi-regularly come through. I can't remember her name. I wrote it down here. There's some serious debate that Leknot, for example, is someone who is from another dimension. I'll talk about her a little bit more in detail later, though. So, so that we've got this multidimensional aspect. Now, I admit I don't like that idea. I've already talked before about how I don't like that kind of concept. I will, however, give them a pass in this case, because it almost doesn't matter. It's basically just a way to have extra-dimensional, ethereal, magical creatures and people show up in an existing thing. Other than Tyrchus, the general idea is that this dimension, this one dimension, actually matters, and I like that, as opposed to most settings when they employ multiple-dimensional stuff, where the strong implication is that it doesn't freaking matter, because there's always some other dimension where you could just bring characters back and have Superman come back to resurrect the other Superman, and you get the point. The other high fantasy thing that I wanted to talk about is the runes. Now, for me, the runes are actually one of the more interesting things to talk about. So there's runes, of course, so I can cast fire, and that's basically via runes. The trues are the only things really worth talking about, in my opinion. Now, I've discussed this a little bit in the past. Having really thought about it, I realized that it's debatable if the trues have personality, sentience, and sapience or not. It's never really nailed down 100% if they do or not. There's two basic theories about this. One is that the trues, by nature of their existence, which I'll discuss in a moment, affect people and thus give the appearance of choice, sentience, sapience, individuality, etc. Or the trues actually do have sentience, sapience, individuality, etc. and that's why they do the things that they do. Both of these are valid interpretations. Feel free to take whichever one you prefer. I actually had a discussion with a friend of mine about this very topic not too long ago. With regards to, he personally believed that they have no sentience, whereas I personally think that they do, although I'm willing to admit that both are equally feasible, because, we don't know, as I previously mentioned. Now, but the significance of the trues, each true, there are 27 true runes. Each true represents an aspect of existence. Now, what we do know about the trues is that they are fighting a extended battle amongst themselves across the multidimensional universe. They are having this massive conflicting battle. Now, I put that fighting in quote-unquotes because everything I've seen about it seems to indicate it's not literally a battle of power or wills or whatever, so much as to say the same way that the moons around Saturn are battling with each other and also Saturn. In other words, I'm probably explaining this poorly, but the idea here is that the basic concepts that they represent naturally conflict with one another, and so by virtue of existing and by virtue of continuing to act in or function in the way that they do, they find themselves in conflict with other concepts. Again, and I keep using the moon. I used the moon's analogy because for me it feels a lot like gravity. Gravity isn't actively fighting against something. It is simply acting in its nature, which is being co-acted against by other forces of gravity and mass and all the other aspects that exist therein, So that's how I like to think of it with regards to the trues and their conflict with each other. Now, one topic that is worthy of discussion is what would happen if a true was removed from existence. Now, Luke, Suikoden 3, believed that doing so would be a beneficial thing. In fact, that was pretty much his main goal. I am actually very curious what would have happened if he would have succeeded, because we don't know. It's like that question in Star Wars, what would happen if the Force went away? Well, we don't know. There's simply too much about the Force that we don't actually know about how it functions on a fundamental level, so we don't really know what its absence would do to the setting. The setting may just go on just fine, or all life may die. We don't know. It could be literally both of those extremes. The setting could actually be better without the Force. Similarly, the exact same argument is here. Now, I tend to lean more towards Luke's idea. I tend to think that the trues, removing a true would be, well, again, I bring up the Daedra parallel. I think a Daedra being removed from Elder Scrolls setting would be a good thing, even though I myself admitted that by my own theory that shouldn't actually be possible, because if a Daedric Lord was removed, then another one would simply be manifested, kind of similar to what happened in Oblivion with the main character. But regardless, the trues definitely conflict with one another regularly. Whether they do it by simply the nature of what they are and their instincts, or whether there is a sentience and sapience behind them, there are a few things about the trues that differentiate themselves from the Daedric Lords, regardless of which interpretation you have. First of all, they need people. They need host bodies and things from the more mundane physical plane in order to function and in order to enact their, and I'm using this term loosely, will. Again, whether it's just their nature or actually they have a will doesn't matter, because the only way for them to accomplish their ends, regardless of purpose, is through people, and hence they will possess people, they will affect people, they will inhabit people, they will follow the orders of certain people, they will influence people, all this fun stuff. Now, one other thing about the trues that really reminds me of the Daedric Lord comparison is the true's nature to completely screw people over. Now, I've heard this debated before, so I'm willing to hear your guys' thoughts on this too, but for me and several of my friends, this was such a duh thing that it never occurred to us to question it until one other person brought it up. So for us, we had always just naturally assumed that having a true screws you. It just screws with your life, destiny, fate, being, sentience, emotions. The idea that having access to a true rune, even if you're not the true commander or holder of that rune, means that that rune starts influencing you. Again, whether by direct will or by its simple nature, and that just warps and twists you into someone more like the rune as opposed to whoever you actually were. Probably the best example of this is actually the Neck Lord, although I'll actually talk about him later. But yeah, the concept that simply like, I have gained the true rune of sun, for example, but then that slowly influencing and affecting me to the point where I am no longer me. I am now the me that acclimates to the sun rune. Make sense? I tend to think of that as a bad thing. It is worth noting that a lot of people who get access to trues have their lives kind of screwed over by the trues, especially in the backstories. And again, Necklord being a great example, although that's debatable too, I'll freely admit. So, I think that's actually everything I wanted to talk about the trues. Excuse me. So, let me look at my notes here. I have a couple notes about the setting. I do find it interesting. Excuse me, that the... So originally there was this kingdom called Aronia, which we actually know extremely little about. We do know that Aronia was basically overthrown from within by a civil war, and this brand new kingdom was founded in its place called Harmonia. And Harmonia became a theocracy religious zealot state, and their big plan, their big modus operandi for the next forever years, for the entirety of the setting really, is the idea of collecting the true runes and trying to utilize them for their own purposes. As you might imagine, the search and desire for true runes and using them for your own purposes is something that is a major motivator for a lot of characters, despite everything I just said, which again also I think fits thematically. Humankind literally leading to their own downfall as they seek things that they cannot control. It's a fairly common theme in real life as well as in fiction. Harmonia pretty much directly led to Highland. Now, the Kingdom of Highland was actually a vassal state of the Kingdom of Harmonia, and kind of grew out of a certain incident. I'm not going to go into super detail on the history. That would take me like 7 hours. There's a lot of backstory. If there's one thing that this game personifies, I should say, it is exonerates. If there's one thing that this game personifies, it is world building. It's actually one of the things that always really interested me about it when I played it back in the day, and to this day when I replay it. The plot isn't really strong. I'll talk more about that later. And the characterization, not a big focus. You know, how many memorable characters of the 108 or more, if you count NPCs, of any given Suikoden do you remember? Usually there's only a very small handful. I actually asked a friend of mine. He came up with Luca Blight, Victor, Flick, and Jowie. And these are the only characters he found memorable in the entirety of Suikoden 2. And honestly, I'd kind of forgotten about Flick myself. So, not a big characterization, but the world building, the settled building is phenomenal. This is a huge, fleshed out, lived in, breathing world. And it's one of the things I love most about it. They really went full out onto that. And if you go around and do all the recruitment quests and do all the side quests and talk to all the people, especially in the multiple games, you will see how the threads from all 5 games do tie into each other. And there is a cohesive narrative thematically and otherwise across all of it. But I digress. So Highland naturally grew out of that. It was basically pushed into the weak city-states, and because of some expansionist policies, they actually had to withdraw, and I love this because even though they had the superior firepower, the forces of the city-states, which I'll talk about in just a second, had much better guerrilla warfare. Now, this is actually very relevant to the plot of this game because it helps to inform one character's backstory, and he's the one who basically sets off the events of the game. I'm referring, of course, to Luca Blight. The city-states that I just mentioned are the Joust, the city-states, the Joustin city-states. I'm not actually sure how I should be pronouncing that. Regardless, they are a effective confederacy, a alliance, a group of different city-states who don't actually agree with each other and don't actually work together really all that well, which is actually their biggest flaw, and indeed basically leads to the downfall of them. After the defeat of Highland, after the end of Suikoden 2, they then unify into an actual republic, a single unified government, which works a lot better. But the city-states have a lot of bad blood amongst themselves. It gets so bad that when it gets to the point where one of them is attacked from an external force, the others don't immediately come to help, even though they're part of a military alliance. They say, well, maybe we'll negotiate instead. Maybe we'll work with them instead. There's a lot of politics in this game too, by the way. Very FFT again. Yeah, poor Muse. Oh my goodness, that jackass who was running it. Now Teresa did a really good job with it, but that's in the future. That's actually after this game. I only want to talk very briefly about the Grasslands because they're much more of a plot component of other games. But the Grasslands is basically a... It's funny looking at this, how much of this is similar to my own setting Primus. I swear it wasn't intentional. I was no doubt inspired by, I love Suikoden too, and the Suikoden world, but like the Grasslands is very similar to Stonehold. It's not actually a nation. It's not actually one unified force. It's a whole bunch of tribes who happen to live in one area, and the other forces tend to refer to them as if they were a singular force. However, one of the tribes of the Grasslands actually does make a play in this game, supporting Highland, which I found very curious until I thought about it for a bit. And I realized, so the tribes of the Grasslands fight amongst each other a lot. And they also tend to interact with the, the Texan Confederacy? Or the Tevex? Geez, I can't remember the name all of a sudden. This is all stuff that's really more relevant in the third game. The point being, they have had regular conflict with Harmonia as well. And we're not even going to talk about the Blood Empire. Or this, yeah. Point being that the internecine conflict that is so regular there is one of the logical reasons why, at least I think, that they would be so desperate to support Highland, even when Highland started losing the war. Because any possibility of gaining that extra territory and having that support to have an edge against the other tribes of the Grasslands would be worth the risk to them. At least, hypothetically, I should say. Now, let's go to my second page really quick here. If I could grab the paper. So, like I said, we're going to talk about some characters here really quick. I don't have that much stuff to talk about character-wise. So, the first character I want to talk about is Jowie. I kind of wrote these in order of when they occurred to me, just for reference. Arguably, Jowie is the main character of this story. Even though Ryu... I have no idea how to pronounce that, by the way. It's R-I-O-U. I'm just going to say Ryu, because that's what I've always said, Ryu. Anyways, Rio is the main character, but he's in many ways a silent protagonist. You can kind of decide his personality for yourself, but other than that, he doesn't have a huge significance to the plot, other than the big thematic thing, which I'll talk about last, of course. Jowie, by contrast, is a very well-defined character who is willing to do pretty much whatever is necessary for what he believes in. In many ways, Jowie reminds me of a more good Delita from Final Fantasy Tactics. And again, I'm not deliberately calling a parallel here. But he is someone who says, all right, this is a screwed up situation. And where Delita said, I'm going to benefit and profit from this situation. I'm going to crawl my way to the top of the heap. Jowie said, I need to try and fix this situation and make it so this war goes away and so people stop losing their lives because of stupid bullcrap. However, despite the fact that I call Jowie a better person, Jowie is actually responsible for more evil acts than Delita is. And I don't mean more as in more evil. I mean numerically he does more horrible stuff and is responsible for a larger number of terrible acts. And he does some pretty screwed up things in his time. And he does it because he's got this big plan to end the war as decisively and quickly and functionally as possible. The idea that if we have this one big grand war, it'll be the last war. Which is naive, like I mentioned earlier, and well, says a lot about the character. It is funny, he reminds me a lot of the gentleman from Serenity, the Firefly movie. I am trying to build a world that I have no place in, that I should not exist in the world I am idealizing. That's not a word, idealizing. I'm making that a word now. Lower runner powers. So I get the same feeling from Joey. He flat out admits he does not deserve to be spared. He flat out admits he deserves to be punished for all that he has done. He will resist you trying to spare him if you're going for the perfect ending, the perfect 108 ending, because he actually thinks he should die. It reminds me of that parallel. But of course, like I said, this is a theme that several other games and works will use. Hence, point from Joey. I also feel that a lot of the reasons why his idealism was spurned on was because of Leon. Leon is a hopeless idealist, someone who literally would actively go out of his way to arrange strategies in combat, specifically to ensure a minimum of losses. Not for his side, just in general. An incredibly hopeless idealist, and someone who I'm sure was a great inspiration for Jowie, and of course the two actually worked together in the anti-Luca Blight conspiracy. I do have to give one credit to Jowie, though. His idea to... his idea to try and take down Highland, and most importantly Luca Blight, from within, rather than opposing him from without, was actually a good idea. It is admittedly amusing to me because he probably had no idea how successful Ryu, whatever, would be in forming the Allied forces, getting the city-states together, and basically ending up, forming the Republic in the end. Because that was the 1 in a million chance. There's no way you're going to do that. The safe bet, the smart bet, the tactical bet would be to do exactly what Jowie did. Get into the Highland Kingdom, work your way into the auspices of Luca Blight, the then king, or prince actually, but very soon king, and then try to marry your way into the nobility and take over in his stead to try and turn Highland into a force of good. Naturally, that really didn't work out too well, especially since the side effects of the war were pretty bad. Now, I'm going to segue for just a second to talk about the Beast Rune. The Beast Rune was something that always kind of weirded me out. The Beast Rune is actually the last boss of the game, but it kind of fits thematically, and I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about that theme here. So the Beast Rune is, of course, a true rune, and we never really get to see it employed. We know Luca Blight was planning to use it as a weapon in warfare, and we know that several other people wanted to utilize its power as well. And yet we never see what that power was. It's always just left to the imagination, unless I missed something somewhere. And I went digging, too. I found several interviews by the people who made this game. I didn't find anything specifically regarding the Beast Rune. It's always puzzled me. So this time around, I just sat back and thought about it. And I've come up with my own theory, which is, of course, supported by the game, but is not actually outright stated in the game. Namely, I think the Beast Rune is basically an allegory for an atomic weapon. I think the Beast Rune, in lore, is a massive, devastating super weapon that they were hoping to utilize. But the only way to utilize it, of course, is to sacrifice lots and lots and lots of people to it. I mean, scores and scores. Most of the citizens of that one town were wiped out just in order to sacrifice them to the Beast Rune, in order to try and wake the thing up and utilize it as a weapon. And that would make a lot of sense given what Luca Blight's overall desire and plot was. But I want to talk about that thematic thing before I go into Luca Blight. Arguably the biggest theme of this game, and I'm mentioning it here because it relates to the Beast Rune and Jowie, is the victims of war. This is actually the biggest theme of all 5 games, I would say, honestly. The idea, and Tierkris is its own thing, so the idea that the whole story revolves around 2 kids, basically. Jowie and Rio are not exactly adults. They're the equivalent of Boy Scouts who kind of happened into circumstances, and their lives were kind of wrecked and kind of ruined by this war. And we see this over and over, repeated constantly. Almost every single character in some way or another has some kind of scar, emotional scar, mental scar, from having been a victim of warfare. And the Suikoden setting is a setting of almost constant warfare. If you actually go down the list and really read into the backstory, there is nowhere that is not at some point or another at war with somewhere else. The Grasslands being a great example. They're in a constant state of warfare. And every time they make peace, that peace lasts for like 5 years. And then it's right back to war again. It is this unending struggle. And there's so many people who are constantly suffering underneath this state, this eternal, perpetual cycle of warfare. Now, this leads into Luca Blight, of course. Oh, sorry, hang on. I'm sorry, I didn't finish making my point. The reason I think the Beast Rune ties into that theme, and why the Beast Rune is a thematic last boss, similar to Necron from FF9, as opposed to a literal last boss, is because the Beast Rune, whether it is sentient and sapient or functioning off of instinct, is basically what you're looking at is the personification of that war, of the lives lost and the sacrifice and the pain and the suffering and all the horrible things that war brings are personified in that 2-headed wolf. And we see in that the very enemy that the player character, and Jowie for that matter, have been fighting against the entire game. And, since we know this thanks to Suikoden 3, they failed miserably at defeating. Once again, I find myself wondering if Luke was right, and removing these truths from the equation and actually eradicating them might not actually be a good thing. Luca Blight, then. I've already really talked about Luca Blight. I don't actually have much else to add, but I'm going to go ahead and rehash it, because you probably aren't even aware that I've actually already done a feature on Suikoden 2, a couple of years ago. Luca Blight, I like him for several reasons. First of all, he has, in a setting that has dragons and beasts and vampires and runes of magic and the ability to scorch away a lake, all this incredible powers of magic, Luca Blight's a guy. He is an individual, big old chunk of plate armor, big old sword. He's basically a barbarian in D&D terms, or a berserker in most other terms. He just fights and fights and fights and completely ignores his own pain and suffering and just kind of keeps going with it. He is, in many ways, the medieval equivalent of the Joker from the Dark Knight trilogy, specifically from Heath Ledger's The Joker. In other words, his power is more in the fact that he just doesn't care, that he is willing to do what other people are not. He is willing to hurt himself far more than others are, and so he can accomplish more than other people do. It's one of the reasons he accomplishes so much. And yet it's funny how early we bring Luca Blight down, isn't it? That always surprises me every time I go through this game. It's like, oh, I'm already at the big Luca Blight thing. He is also a raving psychopath, but I'll talk more about that in a minute. So, the Berserker thing. For those of you who have not played this game, I'm just going to highlight this for you. If you haven't played this game, what the heck are you doing? Listen to this, but, whatever. There's this scene, let's see. So, first we have an army battle, and then we have 3 regular JRPG-style boss battles, and then we have a duel. And in between there, he gets hit by a volley of arrows twice, I want to say. At least, I believe there's one there and one there. So in other words, it takes all of that to bring down one guy who, again, is not magically augmented, is not superhuman. He just doesn't give a crap about his own pain and suffering and injuries, and just keeps going. And I am more than willing to admit I have died on that final duel with him more than once, because that duel is extremely unforgiving. Yeah. But, so I mentioned he is a raging psychopath. I've always had the theory that regardless of his excuse for evil, which I'll talk about in a moment, that Luca Blight was always going to be a bad egg. That even if the horrible things in his past horrible thing in his past didn't happen, he would still grow up to be a psychopath. And I use that word deliberately. I don't mean that as an insult or a general negative term in this case. I mean he is someone who actively, sadistically seeks out harm and destruction to others. He is a detriment to society, a chaotic evil, if you will. A lot of people like to point to him as the example of that kind of archetype. Most other he's usually mentioned alongside the names of characters like Kafka and the Joker, for example, as being just this raging, I want to kill everyone kind of character. And let's make this clear, he does want to kill everyone. That's one of the things I find most fascinating about his character. He wants to wipe out the city-states for all that they did against him and his kingdom and his mother. I mean, there's a reason his sister, let's say she was born out of wedlock. I think that's the nicest way I can put that. So he wants to kill all of them. So it's logical why he'd go to war and why he'd, try to awaken the Beast Rune. But then you might think, well, hang on, he's willing to kill his own people in order to do this and sacrifice his own people, and awakening the Beast Rune would probably wreck Highland as well, at least theoretically. To which I say, yeah, because the other group of people he wants to kill are the Highlanders, his own people, his own kingdom. Because he's so angry and so pissed that his father and his own people were so weak and incapable of resisting the city-states, incapable of defending his mother, incapable of defending his kingdom, that they had to capitulate in the wake of that guerrilla warfare I mentioned earlier. So to him, his own kingdom deserves to die exactly as much as his enemies deserve to die. And that's really Luca Blight in a nutshell. It's amazing what you can accomplish when really all you're after is killing as many people as possible, when you don't really care about long-term consequences. This is the kind of character that Malik would look at and be like, well, dude, pull it back a little bit, man. The last thing I just want to mention about Luca Blight is I do have a respect for a character who, in a magical setting, is so damn beastly. He is this monster of a fighter. He reminds me in many ways of Exar Kun over in Star Wars. Now, granted, Exar Kun had the Force, but Luca Blight is in many ways just as much of a beast as Exar Kun was, and he chops his way through so much stuff. I would be remiss if I did not bring up the most famous scene of Luca Blight, the one that I always hear referenced. I've had some people say it's the most evil thing he's done. I actually disagree with this. Where there's a woman he finds, and she's begging him for his life, please spare my life, I'll do anything. And he says, all right, act like a pig. She's completely confused by this one. Huh? Act like a pig. Okay, so she gets around oinking, oinking. May I go now? He says, sorry. I forget how he phrased it, but basically all pigs must die or something like that. And then he slaughters her on the spot. Just an innocent townswoman, basically. I don't think that's actually the most evil thing he did, though. Personally, I think the most evil thing he did was try to start a war whose only purpose was to kill both his enemies and his own kingdom by massacring his own innocent children troops. They had, I mentioned that Jowie and Rio were basically a form of Boy Scouts. That's not quite accurate. This is more like troops in training. It's kind of a learning. Again, warfare is such a constant aspect of the society, and all these societies and all the culture, this setting in general, that it's rather normal that from a child's age you go into what is effectively school for being a soldier, and that's what they were a part of. This sort of brigade, if you will, of youth, and this youth brigade. Being a way to harness them and teach them the basics of holding a weapon and wielding it and taking orders and formations, all that basic stuff. But again, I want to stress these are still kids. So, and they are kids who are a part of Highland, and so Luca Blight arranges their massacre so he can blame it on the city-states, Muse in particular, I believe, so that way he has an excuse, a casus belli, if you will, in order to kick off the war. He's willing to kill his own children, well, the children of his kingdom, in order to start a war just so he can kill them. That's Luca Blight right there. But of course, he wouldn't have been able to pull it off without Captain Rowd. Now, Luca Blight is pretty definitively evil. Look at me, I am sublime. I am the true face of evil. He's a pretty bad guy. Other than him, though, I'm not sure I could point to any other character who I would say is definitively 100% evil or good. And I mean that sincerely. Suikoden, one of the things it does very well, and again, this would become more of a trend in later games, but it was kind of a trendsetter, is the Suikoden series tends to have a lot of shades of gray in between black and white. And Captain Rowd's actually a good example of that. Now, let me go ahead and make this clear. Captain Rowd is a bastard. He was more than willing to kill his own troops in order to accomplish this end. And yet, he didn't do it out of desire for power or, vicious intent. He didn't do it because he likes killing. He didn't do it because he's sadistic. He did it because he needed money. In no way am I saying this makes him a good character. But I'm also saying it does not make him a completely evil character. It makes him a gray character. It makes him someone who has a layer or two to him. For those curious, he had his sister who had a severe issue with being blind, which might be an issue, as you might imagine, and he needed more money to be able to pay for her healing of that being. And by the way, for those curious, apparently after Suikoden 2, he did succeed, so yay for her. But I mention this because I like this in that it doesn't make him a good guy, but it also doesn't make him a bad guy. His actions are still deplorable, but they're not being done for their own sake. He is, in other words, a character, an actual individual who has some layers to him. And I like that. Victor is another good example of this, actually. So Victor is obviously a good guy, despite the fact that he's kind of a jerk at multiple times. Obviously, Victor being a major character in the first game as well. For the curious, Victor is generally considered the fan favorite in the series. He is also listed as the favorite of the creators themselves. Not really a surprise given how much screen time he gets. Nevertheless, one of the things I see when I look at Victor is someone who had some pretty horrible stuff happen to him, and his story ties very heavily into the Necklords. And after this horrible stuff happened to him, his reaction to that was to basically become more neutral. He didn't become this righteous hero. He didn't get destroyed into some evil villain. He just became a mercenary. Yeah, sure, I'll fight for money. I mean, why not, right? And I get a very Boba Fett vibe from him, and I hope you guys don't take offense to that. And by that I of course mean Boba Fett from the ancillary works, the EU, Star Wars canon, because he's got his own code of ethics, but ultimately he doesn't really have any cause he cares about all that much, other than the fact that he's doing something he's good at for money, and he has his own little belief system that he adheres to, and there's individuals he cares about, and that's pretty much the extent of it. He is, in many ways, just a merc. And I like that. And again, kind of helps add shadings to his character. He also reminds me in many ways of Kamina from Gurren Lagann, a down-to-earth version of Kamina, someone who isn't, as ridiculous as Kamina is. And I like that. I like his overall presentation. I do like Victor as a character. Like I said, one of the memorable characters. Flick, of course, being the other one. Flick was developed more in this one than in the first game. He is the other mercenary character who has also been through some pretty horrible stuff. There's not really much I actually have to say about him other than the fact that, in my opinion, he believes in causes even less than Victor. But at the same time, he is also less scarred than Victor. I actually wouldn't be surprised if Flick was in many ways the moral center for Victor, helping Victor to stay, a relatively decent person and not letting him descend into the darkness that he could if he didn't have someone helping him along the way. It's probably worth noting that the next character, it's probably worth talking about the Necklord, the next character. Now, let's go ahead and say something really quick. First of all, I hate that name. Ever since I first saw it, I always assumed it was a mistranslation. It is entirely possible to this day it's a mistranslation. We still don't really have a definitive answer to that. But he is referred to the Necklord, Neclord, consistently. And every time I see that, I want to say Necrolord, because that makes so much more sense. He's a frickin' vampire who summons undead. But no, he's the Necklord. So either he's the Lord of Necks, or there's another definition. I actually don't remember it right now. Neck actually means something else in another language, so it might be that. I mean, I don't know. It always bothers me saying that name, though. The Necklord, I don't have much to share about him, despite the fact that he is arguably as big of, if not more of a main villain than Luca Blight is. He was also in the first game, actually, very heavily tied into Victor's storyline. He's also heavily tied into Victor's storyline in this game. And so the Necklord is a member of a... He went to this village where the true rune of the moon was. Now, the moon, this rune, ironically enough, actually represents destruction and restoration, as represented by the Necklord for destruction. And did I write? No, I don't think I write down her name. Jean, I want to say. God, there's so many characters, and you know I'm already bad with names. It's really hard to keep them all straight. The former wielder, the true wielder of that true, the woman who eventually ends up taking it back from him. I can't think of her name. Anyways, she is the example of restoration in that. Now, the Necklord himself, though, I find him interesting as a character because, first of all, he seems like he's a fully evil bad guy. You know, in contrast to what I said earlier, he certainly was portrayed that in the first game. He is someone who went to this village and was accepted by it. Very naturally, you know, charismatic gentleman, decent person, and then he just kind of took the rune and became this horrible vampire and made this whole army of the dead thing. You know, there's some messed up parts about that. And he does some really messed up stuff with Daisy, and yeah, I feel for Victor on that a lot. What I find myself wondering is how much of that is Necklord and how much of that is the true. Because he acts quite differently when you actually defeat him towards the end there. And he willingly relinquishes the true, as if he can't wait to be rid of it as long as he has spared his life. Naturally, his life is not spared, he is killed. But I do genuinely wonder if, because I've had several interpretations of this. Some people think he is a traditionally evil bad guy who's just out for himself. And at the end there, what was happening was he was just begging for his life. You know, cowardice, right? Some people think that he was a complete victim. That when he went to that village, he was completely seduced by the true, and it was using him to accomplish its ends. Again, whether sentiently or by natural design, the trues use other people, use mortal people in order to accomplish their particular goals or ends or motives or whatever. Or it's entirely possible that it's kind of a mixture of these two things, that he was not a good person and he was made much, much worse by the inclusion of the true. I don't know which of these is true. I leave it, you know, up to you guys as well to debate. I'd love to hear your theories on it. Personally, I find it interesting that despite everything, he still had weirdly provincial aims. In the first game, he actually became one of the big generals. One of the grand generals, or whatever the heck they were called. And in this game, he actually tries to make his own kingdom out of undead. His aims are unusually provincial for someone who looks like he has no use for any of that. And I find myself genuinely wondering how much of that is him, and how much of that is the true affecting him. I'm really not sure. Just food for thought. A couple more thoughts here, just to toss them out really quick. So, poor Palika. Oh my god. The poor girl, rendered mute from trauma. Again, FF9 would use this idea later on. I like her use as a character because there's not much to talk about her individually as a character, so much as the way other characters act around her. She is used to good effect from a writing perspective in order to add humanity to other characters so that they are fleshed out more, and again it gets back to that whole graying thing. Nanami is also used to a similar effect, but in a different aspect. Rather than being used to flesh out the other characters, she is used to showcase how screwed up the situation really is. She is probably our only viewpoint character into a normal person in the entire game. Nanami, your sister. Because everyone else, to some extent or another, is accustomed to and adapted to this cycle of warfare. And even the main characters, who again I remind you are basically kids, rise up to the occasion and become heroes. And this is kind of a common trend in the history of this setting. Several people have risen up to become heroes. Even Barbarossa basically did the same thing in the first, or rather prior to the first game. So Nanami is a normal person. I'm reminded once again of a quote from Luke Skywalker in the first movie, paraphrasing. I know the Empire's evil and all, but there's nothing I can do about it. A normal person in fiction, if you are offered the call to arms to fight evil and you decline it, you are usually viewed as a coward. It is usually viewed as a bad thing and framed as such, so we, the audience, are supposed to think less of that character. But in an actual fleshed out setting and in real life, that is actually normal. A normal person should not, does not, cannot, will not engage in such super beyond their means capacities. They don't want to take up a sword and go to warfare against the evil empire. They don't want to try and accomplish these great, amazing feats. They don't want to try and become heroes. They simply want to live their normal, ordinary lives. Some people call that burying your head in the sand. But I actually disagree. I think that is very understandable. Those are, if I can be blunt, sheep, but I mean that in a good way. Most people, when you call someone sheep, like that terrible name sheeple, I hate that term. Most of the time, when someone calls someone sheep, they're using it as an insult. I am not. What I mean is you are something precious, something valuable, something that does not have the ability to fully care for itself in a hostile world, and therefore you are something that should be nurtured and protected and taken care of, hence the concept of a shepherd, right? So in my mind, I like it when a fictional setting will have someone like Nanami, one of these innocents, one of these normal people, one of these muggles, if you will, whose entire purpose in existing is to showcase that these incredible events are actually incredible. They're not the norm. That's the norm, and they want nothing to do with this. I don't have much else to share, do I? No, I really don't. I want to mention Leknot. So I actually question if Leknot is actually a Sindar. I'm really not sure. The Sindar themselves, I have no idea if they're actually a different race, if they're just very advanced humans, or maybe they're one of those multi-dimensional creatures. Maybe Leknot herself was multi-dimensional, or maybe she's just another victim of a true. I mean, she did get the Gate Rune after all, for God's sake, so not much else to add there. I probably should have put her first, but I wanted to talk about Leknot at some point. I just have theories and just toss theories. My personal strongest theory is that Leknot actually did come from another dimension originally, thanks to the Gate Rune, and therefore is fully aware of the multidimensional aspect of Suikoden more than most of the characters would be, and that's why she's such a tying in figure for the Trues. I also think she's one of those people who follows the will of the Trues and think it's a good thing, rather than thinking it's a bad thing like, say, Luke did. Anyways, so let's talk about the final thing I wanted to talk about. This game has no central plot. I'm just going to drop that bombshell right there. Let all of you unsubscribe and hate me forever for that comment. I'm serious. There's no central plot to this game. There is a central theme. There's some good characterization. But this is basically Dragon Age 2, except done much, much better. Yep, that's another bomb. I'm just going to drop that there. Feel free to leave me your hate comments. What I mean by this is the life of Xiaoyi and Ryo, and several years in their life. This is not the story of the war between Highland and the city-states. This is not the story of the Necklord and his final defeat. This is not the story of the pulling down of Lucca Blight. There's a reason why the Beast Rune is the final boss. Because this is a thematic story, not a plot-centric story. There are multiple plots in this game, multiple main plots, and all of them equally important, all of them equally relevant. And again, it's like, here is one arc, one chapter of his life, and here's the next chapter of his life, and here's the next chapter of his life, and so forth and so on. And I like that approach. It is actually one of the things I liked most about Dragon Age 2. That Hawk was not some big grand hero, but was rather just, here is several years in his or her life. And I wish they had actually done that better in Dragon Age 2, and this game is exactly why, because we see what that kind of gameplay, what that kind of storytelling is like here. This is his life. This is Xiaoyi's life. This is Nanami's life. This is several years in the life of this world, and we see consequences, we see results, we see actions, we see loss, we see sacrifice, we see death. We see all these interactions between these characters, and that's what really makes this game shine so much for me. And one of the reasons I loved it, and loved replaying it for this Rumination. It was an absolute treat to be able to replay it. Once again, I highly, highly recommend, if you have access to, you pick up a copy. It's $10 on the PSN, not on sale. The PSN gives sales every now and again. It's an amazing game, and I think I am officially out of things to talk about. Hope you've enjoyed this Rumination, and I will see you next week for another old JRPG of some repute.